Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? To find the answer, we must journey back to the early 20th century. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japan was undergoing a period of significant change. As the nation embraced industrialization and modernization, the demand for resources began to outstrip supply. Japan, an island nation with limited natural resources, found itself in a predicament. It needed raw materials, especially oil and iron, to fuel its burgeoning industries and growing military might. As the world watched, Japan turned its gaze towards Asia, seeking to secure access to these much-needed resources and expand its influence in the region. As the 1930s rolled in, Japan's ambitions took a more aggressive turn. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northeastern China rich in coal and iron. The aim was clear: gain control of Manchuria's resources and establish a puppet state known as Manchukuo. This bold move, however, did not sit well with the international community. The League of Nations condemned Japan's actions, but Japan, undeterred, withdrew from the League in 1933. The mid to late 1930s saw Japan's military activities in China escalate, culminating in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan's brutal occupation of China strained its relations with Western powers, particularly the United States. The seeds of conflict were being sown. By 1940, Japan sought to fortify its position by signing the tripartite pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, forming the Axis powers. This alliance aimed to counterbalance the growing influence of the Allied powers, particularly the United States. However, in response to Japan's aggression in China, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed economic sanctions on Japan, including an embargo on oil and scrap metal, crucial resources for Japan's military and industrial machine. The seeds of conflict had been sown, setting the stage for a war that would span the globe. As Japan continued its expansionist policies, it found itself increasingly at odds with the Western powers. In the late 1930s, Japan's military activities in China scaled up, plunging the two nations into a full-scale conflict known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. This was more than just a regional dispute. The war marked a significant turning point in Japan's relations with the West. The brutal occupation of China, marked by atrocities and human rights abuses, strained Japan's ties with Western powers, particularly the United States. However, Japan was undeterred. The year 1940 saw the signing of the tripartite pact between Japan, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy, giving birth to the Axis powers. This alliance was not merely symbolic. It was a strategic move aimed at counterbalancing the growing influence of the Allied powers, especially the United States. Japan was no longer a solitary actor on the global stage. It was part of a formidable alliance, and its actions had far-reaching implications. But actions, as they say, have consequences. The West was not about to sit idly by as Japan continued its aggressive expansion in Asia. In response, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed economic sanctions on Japan. These were not mere slaps on the wrist. The sanctions included an embargo on oil and scrap metal, resources crucial for Japan's military and industrial machine. Japan was cornered. It had grown dependent on these resources to fuel its war machine and industrial growth. The sanctions presented a significant threat to Japan's ambitions, but instead of backing down, Japan saw this as further proof of the West's hostility and a challenge to its imperial ambitions. The economic sanctions and the resultant resource shortages pushed Japan into a corner, triggering a series of events that would eventually lead to the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. But that's a story for another time. The stage was set for a major conflict as diplomatic tensions escalated. The path to war was paved, and the world was about to witness one of the most significant conflicts in human history. In 1941, Japan's occupation of French Indochina and the rejection of the Hull Note marked a point of no return. The year brought profound changes to the geopolitical landscape. Japan, faced with crippling economic sanctions, made a bold move to procure resources vital for its survival and expansion. French Indochina, consisting of modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was a treasure trove of resources. With its abundance of rubber, oil, and other essential materials, it was a lifeline for Japan's military and industrial machine. The Japanese occupation of French Indochina was a strategic play, an attempt to secure these resources and circumvent the economic sanctions imposed by the Western powers. Meanwhile, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands were growing increasingly concerned about Japan's aggressive expansion in Asia. In August 1941, the United States presented Japan with the Hull Note, named after U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull. The note outlined conditions for the lifting of economic sanctions, including Japan's full withdrawal from China and Indochina. Japan viewed these conditions as an infringement on its sovereign rights and an obstacle to its imperialistic ambitions. The Hull Note, rather than deterring Japan, served to fuel its determination. Faced with what it perceived as an ultimatum, Japan chose to prepare for war rather than capitulate to the demands of the Western powers. The last months of 1941 saw Japan making meticulous preparations for war. It mobilized its military, fortified its positions, and planned a series of coordinated attacks across the Pacific. It was a time of escalating tension and clandestine operations. Japan was preparing for a war it believed was inevitable, a war that would alter the course of history. Despite diplomatic efforts, the path to war seemed inevitable. The rejection of the Hull Note and the subsequent preparations for war marked a turning point. Japan was ready to stake everything on a gamble, a surprise attack that would shock the world and plunge it into the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, marking the United States' entry into World War II. This was no ordinary morning in Hawaii. As residents were starting their day, Japanese forces were in the air, ready to strike. Their target? The U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. This wasn't just an act of aggression, it was a strategic move. By crippling the Pacific Fleet, Japan intended to buy itself time to consolidate its territorial gains in Southeast Asia without interference from the U.S. The following day, the United States responded. On December 8, 1941, the nation declared war on Japan, officially stepping onto the global stage of World War II. The surprise attack had not only damaged the Pacific Fleet, but also awakened a sleeping giant. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a pivotal moment in history, marking the U.S.'s entry into World War II and setting the stage for a conflict that would last for years. So, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? In essence, it was a cocktail of geopolitical, economic, and strategic factors. Japan yearned for territorial expansion and resource access, fostering a perception that war with the United States was inevitable. From the early 20th century's industrialization to the invasion of Manchuria, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the economic sanctions, Japan's aggressive pursuits culminated in the infamous attack. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not an isolated event, but the culmination of years of escalating tensions and strategic maneuvers.